Line's good.
Never on.
Whoa.
Hard. Hardly.
Come on, Brent. Line's good. Got real close. Got hair high, right? Try and hit 2/3.
Have they saved it for her? Yes, they have.
Ooh, welcome to Game of Stones, everybody. I am Sean Graham, Scott alongside, as always. Hello, Scott.
Sean, what's cracking?
You know,
Eggs. Eggs is
things
what's
are-
cracking.
Oh, geez. Have you become a what's cracking, get cracking sponsor person?
Hey, if they want to throw a few shekels my way, I won't say no. But I don't know. I thought I'd try a joke. I don't know if it worked.
I'm good with it. I like it.
Okay. If you don't try, you don't succeed, right?
There you go. So we are back. Last week, of course, we talked about the curling schedules for teams. And this week we want to talk about something that has been, I think, front and center, but perhaps not as front and center as it could be in the world of curling as we get into a new season. That is, of course, the diversity and inclusion initiatives that are taking place or have been put in place across the sport. The sport does have some wonderful leaders in this category, and we were lucky enough to be joined by Sabena Islam, who has participated in the Curling Canada events. She was part of the Symposium that took place in the spring. She has been somebody who has been a leader on this issue from Kingston, Ontario. And Scott, you had the chance to first meet Sabena at the Briar in Kingston back in the before times, the last event really that took place before the pandemic.
Yeah, Sabena was volunteering at the Briar there and was just awesome to talk to, really helpful, just made me feel very comfortable being at the event. So big thanks to her for that, and big shout out. I'm excited to hear this talk.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Scott could not join us. Scheduling conflicts prevented that. So honestly, Scott, I'll tell you, I wasn't going to complain. I got an hour with Sabena. It was good. I got to ask and talk about things that I was interested in. So, I'm never going to complain to have a chance to talk to somebody like Sabena, who's so passionate and great on these issues. So let's get right into that chat with Sabena Islam. All right, and Sabena Islam joins me now from Kingston. Sabena, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining us and putting up with my poor scheduling. So we're excited that you're here. So let's just get a little bit of a background on you for anybody who hasn't had the pleasure to meet you or read some of your things that you've put out through Curling Canada and through the United We Curl project. What is your background as it relates to curling, and how long have you been involved in the sport?
So I grew up in a small town called Ignace in northwestern Ontario. That's where I learned how to curl. There weren't a lot of sports to play there, so athletic people played them all, and one of them was curling. So I've loved the game since then. Back then, we didn't have a very a little rocker program or anything. You learned as part of the school in grade 7. So I curled throughout intermediate school and high school. And university, took a little break and then focused on school, played a little rec. And then after we had our second child, I think my husband was like, you need to get out of the house and do something. Maybe you need to get back into curling. So I joined Cataraqui Golf and Country Club, I think in 2003. And at the same time, our older son, Bilal, he was 4 at the time, and he just loved the game from me watching it on TV. He had his little dollar store brooms and balls and stuff. He would be pretending to curl. So I actually the junior program here at that time started at 5, and I sort of begged to have him be in the program at 4 because he was such an enthusiast. And the person who was running at the time said, sure, he can come in as long as you're on the ice with him. So from the time he was 4 to basically that's how I got into more coaching. So I still curled and stuff myself, and some minor competitive stuff yeah. But then I got into I ran the youth program for years in Cataraqui. I started when my son started competitively curling. I did my coaching training with my younger son's team. I'm still they're both curling together this year actually, so I'm coaching them both. So coaching since, and on the ice with kids since about 2003.
Okay. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
a pretty good run on that side of things. And the kids too, they're at a pretty competitive level, right? Like they're playing at a pretty high level at this point.
Yeah, so they were, at provincial type level for both the boys. Their cohort was actually quite. There were a lot of kids curling especially when my older son was curling. So their cohort is quite competitive, especially in Ontario. Quite a competitive sport. There aren't as many. Like before, we had to sign up the day the spiel opened, otherwise you couldn't get in. So there's a lot less kids curling now, but both the boys have had some successes. They've both been to Ontario Winter Games, Ballon mixed doubles, a couple times Camrun in 4-person, and they're had some other provincial opportunities, but never quite cracked that ceiling to get to a national.
Well, there's still time,
They're hoping for the Briar now.
Yeah, they still have that opportunity. Mike McEwen coming to the province might temporarily make that a little harder, but
things.
That's right. But they have that.
But happy for John Buke. He's a local guy. Happy for him that he's on that team. So yeah.
So you obviously do have this strong and lengthy background in the sport. And one of the things that has come out recently with Curling Canada, with their diversity and equity and their inclusion policies, how did you start to get involved with that and with the United We Curl group?
So a lot of this interest, I guess you would say, from the Curling Canada or the different provincial sport organizations came after the turning point was sort of the murder of George Floyd, and I think a lot of people then sort of took notice. And even though we've been here all along, but and there have been issues all along, but I think people organizationally realize that, hey, maybe we need to actually address this and look at how we can become more inclusive and more diverse. So Al Cameron from Curling Canada reached out, and he and Catherine Henderson were doing interviews with people from different marginalized communities, just to sort of get, I think, sort of a state of the union type thing, like trying to find out where things are right now, what some of our experiences have been in the sport in that regard, like being a racialized person in the sport. So we had those one-on-one conversations. Then the group sort of got together and we had several meetings, just sort of Curling Canada sort of had a vision of, what they wanted to do and sort of make some progress. So we had a few meetings about that. Curling Canada did develop a diversity inclusion toolkit, which is available on their website. So we did read through that and give some feedback. So that was good that, so positives. Mm-hmm. It's good that, Curling Canada was looking into it and, realized that there was a gap. And I realized change takes time. Right. But I also feel like, there's a little hesitancy to take the next step sometimes. And so that group hasn't really met. I'm not sure if we've officially been disbanded or what exactly the status is of the group, but we haven't met in quite some time. And, the last meeting in particular that we had, I think I was probably hyper emotional at that meeting because it was in June of 2021, right after, I think it was like a week or two after the murders in London. And the family murdered in London actually happened to be family members of ours. So I was like hyper just emotional in general. And that meeting, when I sometimes look at diversity inclusion things throughout my life. It's been like, it's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to have. It's, it's important. It's important for society, not just for curling. But in the last few years, and especially last year, it's become a health and safety issue almost, right? So where I'm sort of looking at it is, yes, it's important to get curling more diverse to save the sport and, the business case and all that. But from a racialized or marginalized person, and especially like I'm speaking just as like a Muslim hijabi woman right now, I need more active allies in the world so I feel safe walking out on the street. And if we can do that through the curling community, that's great, right? Like if that's something we can start off with, because we have curling as that instant bond that we have something in common, and then from there we can learn about each other and our what makes us tick, and realize that yeah, there might be some differences, but there's a whole lot of other similarities. That is what I need. And from that last meeting at with Curling Canada, I believe people's intentions are in the right place. I just didn't feel like there was enough action being taken. And when I believe I specifically asked at that last meeting, would they hire even a part-time diversity, equity, inclusion lead at Curling Canada, like someone that the clubs or the member associations could go to for support in driving this? Because it's one thing to put out a toolkit, but it's another thing to have somebody like, hey, I got a question. That that was basically, we don't have money for that. That's not in the plan right now. So like that really got me. And I know there were other people on that call who were very, like, I guess frustrated would be the appropriate word to use. So sort of in parallel to all this, Erin Flowers and her group at Goldline were working on the Broom Initiative. So Erin took the lead after, again, what sparked her was the murder of George Floyd, and she and her business partners, Andrew Brett and Pete Townsend, they were, basically like all in on doing something in curling. And you're probably aware of the broom designs by Andrew Pears, Deb Martin, and Graydon Yi Lewison. So we started then. So Erin had that working and going on. And so she sort of brought in some of us from the Curling Canada meetings, basically. So she brought in a few of us there, particularly people who are racialized and who are participating in the sport. And we just, so the United We Curl groups just sort of grew. And, since then, we've had different opportunities through Rogers and Sportsnet, and the Grand Slam of Curling, to spread the message a little bit more. We've basically, we're trying to fill that gap, right? So if we can be the ones who curling clubs can come to, or member associations can come to sort of answer some of those questions, and more like how to do things on the ground. That's our ultimate goal. Obviously, we're all like unpaid volunteers right now. So, and this will take time because we want to do it right. So, we recently were awarded a partnership with Rogers All In as part of their All In for Equity program. And so we have a launch for that coming in next fall. So we have a lot of programming that we're going to be developing and working through over the next year to roll out. And, ultimately it'd be great if we could go into every curling club in Canada and help them with their program. But that's not practical right away. So we're going to pick some pilot areas and develop our programming with them. So a lot of it is going to be education and awareness, and then some other programming as well.
Well, I'm wondering too, because you mentioned working with Curling Canada, the group there, and then obviously the relationship that's been built with the Grand Slam, while also working on the grassroots levels, and you talk about getting things into the clubs at the rec level. So for you, what is the balance or relationship between those two things? Because for a lot of folks, the curling community that they see is what is on TV, like people who don't necessarily play themselves. What they see as the curling community is on the Grand Slams at Briars or Scotties. And as we've talked about on the show before, that's not really a representative group of Canada. Like when I look at Canada as I walk down the street, that's not what's represented at the TV events. Whereas at the rec level, in my experience where I live, it's a little more representative, not entirely representative, but a little more. So for you and the group, how do you kind of find a way to navigate what I think are two very different spaces, from that elite TV level down to the rec level?
Yeah, I think so. These were some of the questions that came out at the Curling Canada did have a symposium in May, diversity and inclusion, and they had like the week long meetings, but 2 days were devoted to diversity and inclusion, and several of us from United We Curl were on panels or presented, and those were questions from a lot of people in that room, and a lot of them were sent there from their member associations or different clubs. So I'm going to sort of just speak to, back up a little. One thing that Curling Canada did do was they awarded grassroots funding grants this year for programs, for different programs. And one of the segments of the funding that you could apply for was for diversity and inclusion programming. So through Cataract Way, I applied for one of those grants, and we did receive one of those grants. It's a 2-year grant for programming, and it has to be for youth because it's from the lottery type funding. So I will be, the first to admit that I didn't do this myself before in terms of active outreach. Like I would mention it to my friends that, hey, you want to curl because it's great, and my kids curl and I coach, and it'd be great. But to actually get people in the club, it takes a lot of work, because curling is not something that a lot of people whose heritage may be from different parts of the world, it may not be the first sport that they gravitate to. Even though like the World Curling Federation, I think, has like 65 or 66 member nations now, but it's not always the first sport that people gravitate to. So I think to make people really feel welcome and feel like they'll be safe when they come in, I think, what I did was make connections with, or reach out to my connections in the community. And those connections in the community were from, various ethnic groups. And I think what helped was, so if I reached out to a friend and she would say, like when she's talking to her community group, then she can say, yeah, Sabena's running this. I've known Sabena for a long time. Like, this is like legit. Your kids will be safe there. It'll be a nice environment for them. So I think having that connection really helped, because when we did the Facebook advertising, we did all this stuff. I did cold emails to all sorts of different groups, basically zero response. I think we got one person because there was a radio interview in town. One person signed up because of that. But the majority of people signed up because I reached out to somebody who knew me and trusted me, and that person reached out to people in their communities who the communities trusted. So that relationship building is really key. And as a sport, I don't think we do a great job with that right now. So, again, people just will throw up the Facebook ads and hope someone comes in. You can't just hope somebody's going to come in, right? Like that'll work for a certain segment of the population. It won't work for another segment of the population, right? So I think club centers, the whole word club I'm trying to avoid using, but we still use it. So people need to really focus on their relationship building with communities. There's different clubs in different communities, and people from that community, like there's very, diverse ethnic communities. And a lot of times people who live like around the block from the club will never set foot in that club. Maybe because they weren't actually invited to come in. Right. So it's one thing to post an ad or do something on social media. It's another thing to actually go to somebody's community center, and I know with COVID it was hard. And so that's why I did a lot of over the phone, but go to a mosque or a gurdwara or a cultural center and say, hey, we've got this programming for kids. And through the grant, it was free. So, the financial barrier wasn't even there. Sometimes there was some transportation sometimes and other barriers. So definitely relationship building is important. I think people are a little afraid of where to start. And I think that was some stuff that came out of the, some of the questions that came out of the, at the symposium, is people are afraid to make a mistake, right? They're afraid to do or say something wrong that's going to offend somebody. And I appreciate that people are actually consciously thinking about that. But we're human, right? And if your intentions are good and you're doing a little bit of legwork ahead of time. So don't just like straight up say, we're going to go into like, I'm just going to use my community as an example. We're just going to go to the mosque in Kingston and just like invite a bunch of people in without taking a look at your environment first and saying, okay, if I have like 30 Muslim kids come into my curling club, what in my curling club is going to make them feel comfortable and like they belong and that they're truly welcome here, and what's going to like scare them or tell them, even it's not to their face, but subconsciously or overtly through, inadvertently through like our menu or the different things that we have, that they're not truly welcome, right? And especially when you're dealing with kids, like adults will sort of deal with a lot of the crap just because we're used to that, right? We're used to being in, not that it's right, but we're used to navigating the world as the other. In North America anyway. in different places in the world, I'm not the other, I'm the in crowd. But in North America, so in Canada, we're used to that navigation. But for our kids, a lot of adults will, take that step back, and because you want your kids to be happy, you want your kids to be safe, you want your kids to be in a comfortable, welcoming environment. So before we do that outreach to the community, or maybe in parallel to that, first you do outreach to the community and just say, hey, we're thinking of doing this. Maybe if you want to come to Cataraqui and sort of take a look at our space and sort of like tell me how you feel and how you think this would work for your community. And again, if I bring in one person from the mosque, they're going to give me like their perspective. So it may not be, but at least you've tried, and at least you've gotten some idea of what people may be considering, right? And then look at your staff. So at Cataraqui, because we it's probably a larger staff because it's a golf and country club than most curling clubs, but still provide some sort of cultural competency training or cultural safety training to your staff to start, or some unconscious bias training. And that, we do like the health and safety committee, we do all that, right? We are concerned about that. So going back to what I said before, like for me, it may not be that physically somebody's going to do something to me that will cause a physical wound. But for me, my health and safety is also my mental well-being. So if I'm going to be treated in such a way that my mental health is impacted, that's not right, and that's not somewhere where I'm going to want to go back. So making sure that we prepare the people. And I realize you can't expect 400 members of a curling club to all sign up to do the cultural competency training or the unconscious bias training, but at least start with your staff. And the other thing is, clubs and provincial sport organizations and national sport organizations say that, we have policies in place, and we have, we've done a review of our policies from a DEI lens. Who is doing that review? I mean, it was the same white guys at the table, right? Straight white guys at the table who are doing the review, who originally wrote the policy. Then you're not really getting a diverse perspective to know if that policy actually, where is the DEI lens coming from? Right. So, saying that you did that review, and then when something actually happens in the club, like say somebody has an insult hurled at them, or, somebody in a position of authority shoots them like a really nasty email or something, how do you deal with it? Right? Like, do you actually deal with it, or do you, now it's a human resources issue, and we have to be silent on it, and we have to sweep that under the rug, and we'll deal with it. And how do we know if you actually dealt with it? And how do you know, how am I going to be safe moving forward if I don't know if you dealt with it, how you dealt with it, if it was dealt with, if that person was reprimanded. So all these things that sometimes we say that we do because we sort of have to do them. And I guess my caution is, don't be performative. So if you want to invite people into the club, do all this legwork ahead of time, do some training, do some education, make sure that is ongoing. Actually, when somebody voices of concern, actually listen and investigate and do something about it rather than sweeping it under the rug. And once you have all these things in place, and I'm not saying it's going to be perfect if you've done all this, but at least you've done a little bit of legwork, then, you can, and you've talked to members of different communities to try to come in and see how they feel about in this space, then go out and actively pursue some membership. So I think we are all quick to jump and just say, like, I need to get Black and brown faces in my club because that's what I'm told I'm supposed to do. But is that going to be in the long run the best for your facility, the best for those people who you're inviting in? Like, it can go really great or it can go really badly if it's, if we don't if we don't put some thought into it. But then if you do make a mistake, say you made a mistake and acknowledge it, right? Like, don't, people walk in with backs up and they're all defensive and, if I dare say, white fragility, that, they're, well, that's like, we can't go there. I know one person I was having a conversation with said, we were talking about DEI and they said, but when people play the race card, that's where I draw the line. I was like, what do you mean by play the race card? Right. So if someone feels like they were insulted or the interaction did have racial overtones, undertones, whatever, if they had that feeling, right? You can't sit there and say that you can't feel that way because now you're bringing up something about race. People are uncomfortable talking about race, but you know what? Those of us who look like this and live like this is life all the time, right? So just because somebody else is uncomfortable talking about it and they feel like, well, if you bring up race, then now, if they were just rude to you, that's fine. But if you bring up the race, now it's something that, you've crossed the line. Well, I think that person needs a little bit of training and education as well, right? So if instead of having your backup, just say, you know what, oops, I just learned something new. And in this situation, that person did say, well, sorry, that's totally not the perspective that I would have taken it from. But after this conversation with you, I have a different perspective, and they were ready to learn. So if you own up to when you make a mistake or say something in error, most people are going to be pretty forgiving. It's when you put your back up and then throw it back on the racialized or marginalized person that it's like somehow their fault. That's where we have a problem. That's where I have a problem with you too. And then I will call you out.
Right. Yeah. And I guess sort of the question that comes out of that is, at that symposium in the spring, did you get that sense from the organizers in terms of why the event was taking place? Because you mentioned that there was a group and it hasn't met for a year, and then they have the symposium this spring. How much of that experience was, do you think, a genuine effort on Curling Canada's part to move ahead with these issues compared to potentially, as you mentioned, like the idea of tokenism or anything like that? All the reports that I've seen out of it, in the moment, was that it was good discussions and a positive experience, but I don't know what the follow-up has been.
Just again, to back things up, I have to give credit where credit is due. The diversity, equity, inclusion part of that symposium was primarily organized by Dr. Heather Mayer from the University of Waterloo, Dr. Richard Norman, Dr. Simon Barrick. So it had a very strong academic component. And that conference was, I think the brainchild of Dr. Heather Mayer prior to the pandemic and prior to the murder of George Floyd. So this was something that, she's been doing in her research for years. Dr. Norman's been doing in his research as well. So this is something that they just wanted. And of course, Danny Lamoureux from Curling Canada was very open to having this. But I think things really, had we had this symposium in May of 2020 prior to George Floyd's murder, I think it might have been a lot different in terms of the reception that clubs or attendees had, or how they took it, how they perceived it, how many people actually showed up. So now having it when we did this year, I think definitely there's more eyes on it. There's more there's a little bit more knowledge because there have been a lot of discussions in the sport. So those 2 days were great. I came away with so much learning myself from the different panelists, from the different speakers. Follow up. So I'm not sure exactly. So if I was so Cataraqui and I are like, we're working, like I'm part of Cataraqui. We're working together to develop our programming and stuff. So if I was a member at another club, I'm not sure if I would have enough confidence, knowledge, ability to, start something this year. Hopefully people, I know different clubs have been reaching out to us or to Aaron or to United We Curl to try to develop things, but I'm not sure if that, I know, I guess maybe it's safer to say I'm not sure if that guidance is coming from anywhere at Curling Canada though. So, and I realize Curling Canada, I realize our curling in this country is a complicated web of, hierarchy and the provincial sport organizations and Curling Canada feeling like they have no real power with member associations or with clubs. But who do people go to if they have questions right now? Right. And what came, like what follow-up came after the session? So yes, all the sessions, the recordings came out, they were great, people's presentations came out, so you have some material. But if I have like a real question, who am I supposed to ask? Right? How what do I have any additional funding for training for my staff or for club members who are interested? Right? Like there's none of that happening that I can see. And I feel like I have my pulse on things, but I'm not the all-knowing in the sport of curling and diversity, equity, inclusion. But I just feel like, if a club needed, times are tough. People are just trying to get, after COVID, they're trying to just get their clubs back up and running. And I realize that, finances are important and, they're trying to, if they had equipment issues, whatever, they're trying to focus their money in that. But if this is truly something that the sport of curling feels is important, then we need to reallocate some resources to it, whether they are human resources or they are other resources like financial resources. If Sport Canada would tie funding to this type of work, people would be integrating it into everything they do all the time.
Yeah.
There has to be a whole shift in the way we think about diversity and inclusion in sport in general, and definitely in curling. And it's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to allocate resources to it. And I don't feel like the resource allocation has been there. So like even in the symposium, and don't get me wrong, the symposium was great. I'm glad we had the conversation. But as you said, like what's happening after that? There have been, Curling Canada, and I'm live in Ontario, so Curl On have like great hashtags, like everyone plays and curling is for everyone. But what substance comes behind those hashtags? And is that actually where the current state of being in the sport, or is that where you want to be? Because if it's where you want to be, that's fine, but say it. So don't put up the ad. So I'm sorry, like I was a little bit triggered by the Curling Canada ad because nowhere in that ad did it say that we're not quite there yet, but we're working really hard, right? So it's great to have this vision as to where you want to be, but it's also important to be realistic as to where you are right now. Because otherwise it's sort of false advertising to somebody who wants to sign their kid up. Because fine, that commercial, the Curling Canada commercial had like or not just their kid, some adult who wants to sign up. Curling Canada commercial had like, was very diverse. But if you walk into even if you walk into Cataraqui, right? Like one of my kids moved out of Kingston. So like there's me, one of my kids, maybe like a couple other people I can probably count on like one hand, maybe a couple fingers on the other hand. So it doesn't look like that. Like maybe places in the GTA it's a little bit better, but let's just be honest about where we are right now, right? And if you're not honest about it, I don't think you can really tackle the problem. So like in Ontario as well, there was this whole diversity inclusion strategy that was put out, and there's a strategic plan for a 4-year strategic plan, and there's like whole unveiling and stuff. Like who developed that plan? Who was at the table? Because for like a couple months there was a diversity and inclusion panel that I was part of, but that was like banded very abruptly. then this plan just sort of came out. So who is at the table developing this plan? And this plan, when you read it, what are the actual tangible things that clubs can do to increase inclusion or diversity at their level? Right. So the organizations, provincially and nationally, are trying to do stuff, and they know that they have to do stuff, and they feel like they have to do stuff. But if you're just doing it because you feel like you have to and not because you really believe it and you really want to, I don't think we're going to see real change coming from those organizations. So whether it's the leadership in those organizations or it's the people who are tasked to do this work, or if it's just they don't have enough funding in their organizations. And I totally understand that both those organizations, for instance, are quite small. But then I look at Curling Alberta, and they just have a different, it seems like a different amount of dedication and genuine interest in diversity and inclusion. So yeah, I don't know what to say other than I don't think we're doing enough.
Sure.
Like I didn't say enough already. Yeah. I don't think we're doing enough. And I think there needs to be stronger leadership and resource allocation.
Yeah. And one of the things that I wonder about when I think of this too is for Curling Canada, for the provincial associations, a lot of their focus seems to be on that elite level, especially for Curling Canada, where so much of the funding comes from World Championships, from Olympics, and then just internally their revenue events are the Brier and the Scotties and whatever World Championship is held in Canada. So their focus is on those events and having Canadian teams win medals. And it's hard to say to them, you have to have the diversity inclusion at that highest level when the development of those players has to start in clubs. And so it seems like there's a disconnect between those two things where they're totally focused on winning gold medals, winning medals, and yet to ensure that there's a diverse group of individuals who are competing for those gold medals coming out of Canada, it has to start at the grassroots level. And that the investment doesn't seem to be going towards the grassroots level in incredibly meaningful ways, so that if we look ahead 10, 15, 20 years, those kids who are doing Little Rock programs now would be at that championship level. Like that needs to really take place in order for us to see that reflected on our screens when we turn on an event. And that's a long-term project that, as you're talking about, doesn't seem to be there yet.
Yeah, definitely. Like everything usually in life comes down to money, right? You're right. Yeah. So if the money for Curling Canada is coming from these events, then they need to keep investing in that. But then I also often hear that if we don't diversify curling and if we don't bring in more people of diverse backgrounds into curling, this sport is going to die, right? So if that is also one of the big issues in the sport, that we don't want the sport to die, then you need to look at, like I was saying, the resource allocation. So if Curling Canada is not going to take some money and spend it at grassroots level for development. And I mean, again, they do have the for Love Curling, or like they do have the foundation money. I don't totally agree with how all that money is being doled out, but that's for another podcast. Right. But there's things that you could do, right? If you want to nurture kids at a competitive level, because that's where you feel like your revenue streams are, then start a program for nurture. So once, kids who are coming out of the program, like I have at CAT, maybe then you identify a few kids from different parts of the province or different parts of the country, and you nurture them. Like in Ontario, the Ontario Curling Council started this, I'm going to mess up the name of it, but basically it was like a select team that they have this year, and kids tried out for this, and so they're receiving they're receiving funding and coaching and all this. So those kids are going to get a lot of attention and funds and great coaching, right? So you could, if you wanted to, you could do the same thing, but say we're going to pick from a different pool of kids, or and I'm not saying all 4 kids need to be racialized, but you can say, look, for this team, we need to have we need to have like at least like half the team, if we're going to provide funding, needs to be from diverse backgrounds. I mean, people are going to say tokenism. People are say you didn't deserve the money. People are going to say whatever they want. The haters are going to hate. But if you want to develop the sport, we need to see people who look like us, in the sport at the higher levels to attract younger kids. Like Nazim Kadri bringing the cup on Saturday to the London Muslim Mosque. Like my nephew was there, my cousins were there. Like that's a huge deal, right? And for people in our community to see somebody that looks like them win the cup, that's huge. So if we don't have that in curling right now, and we're not even trying to develop it, we're going to continue to have this problem. So we're going to talk about it. We're going to say all the right things. So we're going to say it's important to us. But then if we don't actually put that into action, it doesn't really mean a lot in the end. Right. And I don't want to negate all the good stuff that people are doing, but I just feel like there needs to be a more integrated approach to this. And right now it's like you're saying, like competitive curling and what we see on TV is over here. And then, and if there happen to be a few people at that level, great. There are, there is Indigenous representation. United We Curl member Brittany Tran, shout out. She's at, that level. But, there's a few people, again, you can count on one hand probably, that between the Kuis and, that are at that level. So if we don't help bring people to that level by providing extra resources and funding and training to nurture them to get to that level, you're not going to have that, right? So I just remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember Rudy Ramcharan from
with Kevin Martin,
right? So to see the brown guy win like a Brier was like so exciting for people in the South, like in my community, right? So like, and that we need that. And we need role models, but to get there, we need to do a little bit of investment, and you need to change the way we think, right? And we need to change the way we approach this, and we need to have it integrated, like up and down, up and down and across, like all over. We need to have it integrated.
Yeah, and I think too, the under 18 from last year, and I forget where it was held. I believe it was in Ontario, but I watched some of the streaming of it. It seemed like that was a more diverse group than some other national championships I've watched at that level. But then the question is for those kids who are participating there, what supports are there when they get to the under 20 level? And then the big one, of course, is that transition from the under 20 into men's and women's play, which is where we lose a lot of players anyway. And then in particular, can we support individuals who otherwise have not gotten support previously? And those are sort of those programs. So I don't know how optimistic you are about things moving forward. And I don't want to create a binary of like optimism versus pessimism, because that's certainly not fair. But I guess just sort of moving forward as a curling community, you've touched on it already a little bit, but what are some things that we can do in our respective individual communities across the country or internationally, for anybody who's listening, to just ensure that everybody who comes is welcome, and we're creating a space where everybody can come and really enjoy what is a fun sport? Like, it's, the strategy on ice, like really what can be better than that? Like, how can we make it so that everyone continue to work towards an increasingly inclusive, welcoming environment?
So before we get to that, I just want to shout out to, the U18, especially in Ontario, U18, U21. And because I've coached boys, mostly the boys teams. I mean, the U20 winning skip was Asian, like Landon Rooney, I think for the first, maybe that's the first time ever in Canada. I'm not sure, and some of the other kids that were at nationals at U18 level have either played with or competed against my kids. So, definitely, there's definitely movement there, which is great to see.
And we should say too, sorry to interrupt, but Landon too got the invite, I believe, to the PointsBet spiel as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he'll be there with his team, which will be cool to see. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what we can do. So I guess, If I were to break it down, I guess start building relationships in your community. Each club is probably going to need a champion who prioritizes this and who takes the lead on this at their club. So if that champion can start working towards with their committee, hopefully they don't have to do it on their own, to build relationships within the community. I will say that if you do have an existing membership that is from a racialized or marginalized community, you can ask them to participate in that outreach, but don't expect them to do all the work for you. Like, definitely, as somebody from those communities, I want my voice to be heard and to have a seat at the table, and I'm happy to help. Not everybody wants that or wants that burden, because it can be time consuming. It can take a toll on you emotionally as well. So start developing those relationships and bonds within the community. Just one thing I want to just mention as part of this too is, a lot of times if we're going to ask racialized and marginalized people within our clubs or within the sport to basically be our consultants, then pay them as consultants. Someone is coming in to look at your ice or rocks or, whatever at the club, they'd be paid for their work, right? And so a lot of people in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion are racialized and marginalized people that are doing this work who are not getting paid, but we somehow find the money when it comes to other things. So I just want to throw that out there. So have a champion at your club, and then do some outreach, do some internal work. So there are a lot of great webinars, podcasts, books, things that you can educate yourself with. Global Initiative for DI and Curling has done a bunch of webinars. Curler Outreach Program has done some webinars about inclusivity as well. So there's, different, those are all curling specific, but there's just general education that you can do just so you feel a little bit more comfortable talking about things and feel like you can prepare your environment a little bit better, right? For people to come in. And then, once you've built some relationships with the community, then you can do that targeted outreach. And just say like, hey, we're having this thing, like maybe go to the communities and invite them in. Open up your curling facility to the neighborhood more. So it just shouldn't be just for curling. I think in one of the pieces that Donovan Bennett did, he was talking about how it's like the neighborhood hub, and it can be more of that. But it's like, which neighbors feel comfortable enough to even come in? So like if there's in the summer, if there's hall rental, maybe you need to actually go out to like different communities and say like, hey, like, everybody's welcome for this hall rental. Like, anybody can use it. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to be a curler or golfer or whatever. Anybody can use it. So just even if people are coming in for non-curling things to begin with, then maybe they just might have a better feel for the facility. Yeah, so education, outreach, and then target outreach. Make sure your policies and your review of policies actually mean something, and if something bad does happen, that you actually address it, and you then revisit policies and review, because you may think it's great, but when something actually happens, it may not be good enough. Be open-minded, be aware of what's happening in different communities. I think that was one of my closing points at the symposium, right? Like, care when something happens in the community. So, when George Floyd was murdered, there weren't a lot of Gold Line came out with a statement. I don't think Curling Canada, like most places, most organizations in the sport of curling, most teams in curling even didn't come out and say something, right? But when something that big is happening in the community and you don't even acknowledge that it's happening, and then tomorrow you go to the Caribbean Cultural Center and say, hey, come curl. Well, what do you think people are going to, like, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah. Like, when the murders happened in London, like, radio silence from the curling community. But when and all these are tragedies and I'm not saying one has more weight over another, but like when the hockey players were killed in the bus accident in Saskatchewan, I believe it was Saskatchewan.
Yeah, the Humboldt crash.
Yeah, Humboldt. Everybody had, the curling community was out with, on their social media. The curling organizations were out on their social media. I'm just saying that there's sometimes pick and choose as to what we recognize as a curling community and what we don't. And what we do choose to recognize is often for the dominant culture and not for the diverse communities that you're trying to welcome. So if you're trying to be more welcoming, then acknowledge different holidays and festivals, right? Like, even if it's just a tweet, or if you're doing something for St. Patty's Day, but then maybe there's some other holiday that you could be recognizing, even if you don't have that membership right now and you want to grow that membership, have an event, invite people in from that community, right? So I think it's just people really thinking about being inclusive. Like, it has to be all the time. It's not just bring a few people in and teach them how to curl. It's like, what can we as a community be doing overall? And part of that is understanding social justice issues and being involved in those in the community, right? That's how you meet people from different communities, when you actually get involved in these things, right? Like, I'm part of an anti-racism working group. There's people from all sorts of different communities in that working group with the city, right? But if you stick to just the current curling community and that's your whole circle, and I will be quite honest, in the winter that is pretty much my whole circle. But right, you're not going to meet other people. You're not going to develop that comfort, because people are, if you've never talked to a Muslim woman wearing a hijab before, you may not feel comfortable talking to me. But after you talk to me, you can realize that we can have a conversation for an hour, and and it's really easy, right? So
Absolutely.
Until you reach out and make that effort, right? You can't just expect the people in the racialized and marginalized communities to be making all the effort. We as a curling community need to make that effort as well.
Absolutely. Very, very well said. I know you have to run to another meeting. So Sabena Islam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
So there you have it, my chat with Sabena Islam. Of course, thank her for her time. She was very generous. Actually, kind of went over what I said I would take in terms of the time with her. So very appreciative of her joining us and with her patience with me on a scheduling issue that we had before we recorded, and then taking a little more time than we had agreed to. So Scott, I've really enjoyed hearing from Sabena. Having the chance to talk to her there, some of the stuff that she's read. You'd met her before, as we talked about off the top. I think somebody who has a lot to contribute, obviously, and somebody who is, in my mind, certainly emerged as one of the great leaders in our sport.
Yeah, always nice to hear from Sabena and hear what she's got to say about this diversity and inclusion initiative. Curling Canada, of course, has resources available on the website, but it's always nice to hear from somebody who's actually doing the work and sort of on the ground with respect to the initiative. Great ambassador for the sport, Sabena, too. Great voice to have in our community, and really enjoyed your chat.
Well, thank you. And as you said, check the show notes below. We'll link to some of the resources that Sabena talked about, and make sure that everybody has access to all that wonderful material that has come out. And as always, if you want to reach out to us with ideas on things that we can do to further the cause of diversity and inclusion in the sport, or if there's things that we can promote or just whatever, please do reach out to us. This is certainly going to remain an important priority for us here on the show. So with that, we thank you for listening. And if you have not yet, please do subscribe to the show wherever it is you get your podcast. Do the likes, the ratings, comments, all that stuff helps other people find the show, keeps us growing. You can always, of course, head on over to GameOfStonesPod.com. All of our past episodes are there, plus a link to the merch, with all proceeds going to Food Banks Canada, the Sandra Schmerler Foundation. We match those. And if you want to reach out, let us know what you want to hear on the show. It is GameOfStonesPodcast@gmail.com, Twitter and Instagram @GameOfStonesPod, Game of Stones Podcast on Facebook. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. Scott, sometimes I wonder, how is it that we can be in September and I feel like we're in the middle of the season somehow? even though we haven't started to play.
Yeah, maybe, I'm looking out the window. This tree is just starting to turn. We had some crisp, cool evenings, and the sun is setting earlier and earlier. Maybe that's where you're getting it from. I don't know.
Maybe. I don't know. I'll tell you though, fall is my favorite season, like by far. It's not even close.
It's everybody's favorite season.
Yeah.
Anybody that says otherwise is lying or they're dumb.
Yeah, just the crunch of the leaves, especially here in Ottawa, where I live. A lot of trees along the canal, right behind Parliament Hill. Sort of the backside of the hill is just all trees. It's just a spectacular view in the fall. It's just a wonderful time of year that transitions into not a wonderful time of the year.
Yeah, it's beautiful, Sean. And you know what else it means is that fantasy football has started.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's I will say I don't think it's going well so far, but I'll leave it at that. And maybe provide updates if people are interested, which no one is.
Well, we wish you the best of luck, Scott. We wish everybody the best of luck out there with their fantasy stuff, and happy start to the curling season for all of you who are going to be getting started in the next little while. We'll be along the ride with you as we get set to play ourselves. So until we talk again next week, thanks for listening, and keep those brooms on the ice, and don't dump that intern.
Make the final.